Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for a timely conversation about the role of media in crisis and disaster response. I'm Amanda Byrd, and I'm the Senior Director for Communications here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. I'm joined today by two leading journalists whose natural state is basically working through disaster as part of their job descriptions. So I'm really pleased to introduce you to Jacquie and Erin Ailworth. Erin works out of the Chicago bureau of the Wall Street Journal, where she covers hurricanes, wildfires, and other disasters and traumas nationwide. Jacquie provides in-depth analytical journalism about the pharmaceutical industry, and she covers the politics and policy that revolves around that for Bloomberg. So thank you both for being here with us today and for making time for this important conversation. So I just want to kick us off today by acknowledging the obvious. Right now, we're in the middle of three kind of interrelated crises. We have the public health crisis, we have an economic crisis, and we have a social crisis. Informing the public during these uncertain times, newsrooms, they've made coverage of these issues the top priority. But at the same time, I think informing the public is more challenging than it's really been for a long time. So we're really grateful for you guys to be here with us today and take a look at what this looks like from your end. So I think just to start out, like I said, working through a crisis is what both of you guys do day in and day out. But how would you say that this moment in time compares with other crises that you've worked through? Maybe if we can start with you, Erin.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. And I basically say that it's different in a few ways. First of all, we're dealing with a lot, but the biggest one, of course, is the pandemic. And at least in the normal course of things, like I'll parachute into a disaster, like a hurricane or a wildfire, often coming in the aftermath, spend, several days, a week, a couple of weeks somewhere, and then go home. So you enter and exit the disaster zone, if you will. With the pandemic, we're always in it. And we're not just reporters of it, we're also experiencing it as regular citizens as well. So there's not that dividing line between work and personal life. We're always, in it in some way, either reporting on it or living through it. And so that erases the distance that you can sometimes protect yourself with emotionally, if you will, and means that you're just constantly under stress and constantly working in some way. And so you have to be much more aware of taking a break and self-care and how it's affecting you. And I would say the same thing is happening with a lot of the social justice too, that affects us as well. I'm also a person of color, so I get asked a lot of questions from people who are, just trying to parse it in their regular life as well. So I get asked questions as a journalist reporting on the topic, and then again by friends and family who are trying to figure things out. And so again, there's no separation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. At the end of the day, we have jobs to do, but you're still people too. And there's really just not been, I don't think, a breather in the way that you would normally experience that. So Jacquie, do you have anything, you'd like to add from your perspective about how this feels different than, previous situations that you've worked through?
Well, first, thanks for having me. And I definitely agree with what Erin said. I think because it feels like the stakes are so much higher now than they have in the past, just because it's permeated literally every part of our lives. And as she's mentioned, as a journalist, you feel burnt out, but also, the sources you're talking to, especially the public health officials you're talking to, they also feel burnt out. It feels like this is also just a very combative time generally, and that makes it harder, I think, for everyone to everyone's kind of trying to do their best. But I think just given how, politically things are very tense right now, socially things are very tense right now, that adds, more fuel to the fire.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, obviously this impacts all of us on a personal level. On a professional level, what would you guys say are some of the barriers that, kind of having these compounding crises has presented for you guys in the media to be able to do in your job? What are the sort of like unique issues that maybe you're experiencing now that you haven't, maybe come across frequently in the past?
Access, of course, is a huge one, given that we are all trying to limit, face-to-face interactions. So travel is restricted, even, in-person meetings that you might informally do just to keep up with a source relationship, that's much harder as well. And so there's a lot more to do by phone, trying to hook into things like Zoom and video calls, to get to that personal level of detail that you might get if you were doing an interview face to face. So I think access is a big issue. And then just because you have so many things happening all at once, I mean, it's like you don't, these are fast moving situations already. And then to compound it with like 3 of them happening at the same time, you're not getting to spend as much time as you might want on a specific story or to delve as deep as you want to initially. And I think, we're mobilizing lots of reporters to help with that, but it means that like you can be on 3 different stories in the span of a week, or or stepping back and only on one, but then missing the other 2. So
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure even just capturing the visual component of stories on the ground is extremely limited. I think we've all felt that with technology, we're able to keep going and do, a lot of our jobs much the same as we were before. But there are some things that, are just really unique to this situation that we're in right now. Jacquie, I wanted to ask you, so in this crisis, the speed of information coming at us, the questions coming at us, it's all amplified. What are some of the things that, can make your lives easier as journalists as you're working on a story?
I think I think people always need to be vetting the information that they're putting out there. And I think that there's been more of a burden on a consumer or a reader to verify everything they're seeing that there hasn't been in the past. I think that's, with social media, that has become more and more of an issue, but especially now when there is so much misinformation. Just because, for example, like we don't really have a lot of media literacy in this country in terms of like for high school students or middle school students, or even just like your average Joe who might not be plugged into all of this industry stuff. They might not really know what to look for in terms of, well, this clearly isn't very reliable. Well, this Twitter, handle is verified. So that must mean that all the information coming out of this social media person is accurate, when we know that's not the case. So I think that if companies could be better about verifying the information before they put it out, it would make our job of, kind of doing the backstop verification on our end a little bit faster. I also think that as a consumer, you kind of have to stop and think, okay, someone's giving me this information. What is their motive in giving me this information? Like the FDA is really cracking down on companies that are selling like vitamins and all these things that they're saying are going to treat COVID when they aren't. And so I think that there's a big financial incentive for some of these seedier companies to really prey on people's hope for a treatment and for a vaccine, and on their fear of the uncertainty of the future. So I think we all just have to be more vigilant about what we're consuming, and really, I think, dial in on, a handful of sources that we really trust to kind of backstop any of the misinformation we might get elsewhere.
Yeah, I love that you brought up media literacy too. I read a Pew study recently, not to throw a bunch of like numbers at people, but I think it was only something like 30% of people felt confident that they would be able to, in their ability to fact check what they're reading. And so in the sort of, constant 24/7 media environment, social media amplified on top of that, it makes it, just sort of ripe for maybe bad actors to get in there. And I think it just makes our jobs that much more important. So.
Well, and I
And
think
especially because, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Oh.
I was just going to add, especially because things are moving so quickly that a verified source of information could tell you one thing one day, and then that could change because we've learned something new. And I think that rapid change has also kind of cut away a little bit at the confidence that the public has on really trusted sources of information, just because we're not used to having that uncertainty, especially when it's coming from, our officials.
That's right. Yeah. The more we learn, the more we're able to communicate, but the more sometimes it seems like maybe we're sending mixed messages at the same time.
And that's where I think agencies, companies that are dealing with the facts and the data can help journalists by making that information accessible in some way, putting it online, making sure that it's constantly updated, making sure that it's in an easy to understand format. Or, if it needs a little bit more parsing, having someone who, available, who can help explain it to a journalist so that we can do that fact checking, that verification, do our due diligence when putting together a story and giving out the best information.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it probably also, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but it sounds like it probably would also make building those relationships with your resources and just having that level of trust even more important. Do you find that has been true? And if so, do you think, is that maybe even limiting in a way that, you're not able to vet the diversity of perspectives that, or is that a problem? Maybe it's not a problem.
I mean, I think, you're definitely in a situation like this going with, at least initially, with people that you know and trust and have a relationship with, in large part because they will answer your phone call often. And when you're working on a deadline situation, time spent reporting matters, and getting something out quickly matters. I think that as we've gotten deeper into the pandemic and then had these other issues pop up, I've seen like universities are getting much better at sending out emails with like, here are our experts on XYZ topics. That can be very helpful because that introduces me to new people, all the time in an easy way. And it gives me, like, if they put in, an email contact or a phone number, like, even better. So, once you have the time to step back and go looking for other perspectives, it's great. But, in the heat of the moment, you're typically going to go with someone you have a relationship with. And that's why I always tell people, don't just call me when the crap is hitting the fan, but like, let's start talking long before that. If you think you should be somebody that I know and talk to, reach out, and I'll do the same. Every time I come across someone, I pop an email to them or put in a phone call and just say, hey, I would love to pick your brain at some point informally, and maybe it will lead to a story.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to sort of the role of media to inform the public. So another challenge I think that we're all seeing play out in real time, the public's attention span, it waxes and wanes over time. There's just a limit to how much people can or will pay attention to an issue. Going back to that Pew study that I cited earlier, 7 in 10 people said that they just need to take a break sometimes from COVID-related news. I think it's been all COVID all the time for, going on 4 months now. But especially when there are new developments happening constantly that impacts, the set of facts that people are using when they make important decisions. For other disasters, it might be, do we need to evacuate? For COVID, it's, should I be wearing a mask? It can be all of these things, but it can be a real public safety issue. So when you guys are thinking, does that information exhaustion impact the way that you guys approach your reporting, or should it? Jacquie?
Definitely. I think it should, because you know that, I mean, like you said, you know that the public is tired. I think that that really affects the type of stories you decide to pursue and which stories you can just let go. I think, especially now, I think and this tends to happen a lot in political stories, of the so-and-so said this X night, so-and-so rebutted by saying this X night, you know, kind of this back and forth, this ping pong, that kind of can happen with political stories, I think become less important now. I think that what people really need is more holistic stories. They need more investigative stories. I think outlets are starting to see that and are starting to do more of that. At least I know, I can say personally in our outlet, we are doing that because we know that people are exhausted. So it's a matter of, if you can only get people to read, 5 stories a day, make sure that they're the 5 that you really want them to be reading. Make sure you're promoting your best stuff. Make sure you're writing things that are actually worth people reading. And looking at the landscape out there, what is not being said? What either what perspective or what story hasn't been told yet? So there's less of kind of repetitive stories and more original stuff that's going out there that can actually be useful to your reader.
And giving them different formats too. So we've done a couple of live blogs when things are just moving super fast and you're just going to shoot up, a couple quick paragraphs on, the news of the moment. We found that to be very popular. We've had a daily COVID story that continues to be, one of the most widely read pieces. And so we just keep doing it. It's basically a wrap up of the day's coronavirus news. So we have that going. But then we also talk a lot about non-disaster reporting and making sure that we're also keeping on top of all of the other news. I mean, we have a whole world out there where news is still being generated that is not related to the pandemic or to social justice or wildfires or hurricanes. So trying not to forget that you have those those stories that also still need telling, and making sure that you're giving reporters, especially when they need a break from some of the other stuff, a chance to step back into those news pieces.
Have you guys found, especially recently, the newsletter format, the sort of like daily roundup, has that been kind of an increasing focus for your publications, or do you still find that sort of like the one-off stories are getting traction? Where's the sort of attention balance there right now?
Definitely newsletters and those type of live update blogs that Erin had mentioned. We do something like that too. I think it's the fewer amount of places that someone has to go to get all the information they want, the better, because then they don't have to like ping back and forth between all these different tabs. So definitely those kind of wrap ups of, in the morning, here's what you missed from yesterday, and then in the evening, kind of here's what you missed from today. I find to be very useful for people, and myself personally. I enjoy reading those. I think they're the most helpful.
Right. Yeah. Well, and they're themed too. So like, we've got our editor-in-chief's 10-point of, his top, picks for the day. But then we've got a newsletter all about, here's your latest coronavirus news. Here's your latest sports news. Like it allows people to, get a list in their inbox of the stories that they're most interested in. So.
Mm-hmm. And at times I think, while I think that like journalism in general is becoming more of a niche thing, like more people are requesting, I want to have this newsletter for this particular topic. I want to have this publication for this particular topic. It's becoming more niche. And I think that's great because they all have their expertise areas, but at the same time, and this is why I think having like a physical paper or a physical magazine is so useful, is that you will read things that you're not used to reading or you normally wouldn't decide to read. So I think that while like the newsletters of like, here's the COVID stuff that's the most important today, and here's all these different niches, all outlets have those, like in terms of they have like the siloed news outlets, but having the general read, I think, is still really important because it's going to make you a more well-rounded person. It's going to make you, have understand what's going on outside of your, outside of your blinders, outside of your blinders. So I think that it's important to have those general, like some aggregation of general news as well for that reason.
Sort of like self-selection element there. And I totally agree. That's like a whole separate conversation that we could dedicate another hour to, but at least when so much is coming at us and there are so many stories at once, having the kind of like aggregation on the newsletter has been just super helpful for me to be able to keep track of all of the moving parts. So I think, sort of talking about that self-selection process, the 24/7 news cycle, is one challenge, and sort of the waxing and waning attention that, comes with that. But, I think it's really only intensified by the more participatory conversations that are taking place across our social media platforms. So how has social media, Erin, for you, helped or hurt your ability to effectively communicate during a disaster?
Well, I actually think of social media as a virtual man on the street in a lot of ways. One, it's a stream of information as long as there's power and a cell signal. There's not always in a disaster zone that can help keep you connected to what's going on, and give you a way to find people. I mean, with social distance and not being able to go as much in person to a place, I've found that social media, particularly Twitter and Facebook, have been extremely helpful for identifying potential people I might want to talk to. Now, you still have to go through the same rigorous verification, make sure that they're a real person, that they are who they say they are, that they've had the experience that they say they've had, or the expertise that you're looking for. So you still have to vet them, but in general, I think, it's a helpful tool for journalists. Where it's problematic is that, people put anything and everything they want on social media, and it's not all true or verified. And so parsing through that and having people recognize, the work that I'm doing, the work that Jackie's doing as legitimate, good journalism over some other tweet, is getting harder and harder.
Yeah, absolutely. Jacquie, what have you noticed about that? Sort of what's your perspective on that?
I think I totally agree with everything Erin just said. I think social media is like the ultimate double-edged sword. You can use it as an asset, but you also don't want to be over reliant on it, and have that be your sole source of information. It's excellent because it's democratized our access to information so much, and we have way more perspectives now that can be included, because it used to be that you would have these gatekeepers of information, and there isn't that as much as there used to be. And that's great for having more perspectives, but it also creates a lot of noise, and it makes it harder for people, I think, to pick out the most useful bits of information or the truthful bits of information from all of that feed. Mm-hmm. So I think it's kind of like everything, it's best in moderation. I also know that it probably can cause like a lot of, at least I feel this way, can cause a lot of burnout. You're just kind of scrolling through your Twitter feed, and it can feel really, you're inundated with all this information. It can feel very overwhelming. And I think especially with the algorithms that, are on Facebook and Twitter as well, it can also steer you towards things that are really going to be tailored towards you, kind of really deepening that niche of information you have. And so that's why it's important to kind of step out of your digital bubble for a moment, during the day, to kind of get some perspective about what else is happening.
Yeah, I find my Twitter feed, just because it is so self-selected, to just be the most comforting place sometimes. But it's also
that's awesome.
Social media can be my primary source of information. You have to get a larger perspective from the world outside of your happy place. So, so especially in a crisis. But I think we're seeing this writ large. There are usually a generally accepted group of facts, but we live in strange times. And so what helps you guys combat misinformation? What are sort of like the biggest things? I know there are all kinds of steps that you and your publications take to make sure that there's fact checking in place, but what would you walk us through sort of what that looks like, and what are the biggest, I think, the biggest things that help? Jackie, if you want to start off.
So this is a great question. And so I was actually just DMing with someone about this yesterday. And I think some of it has to do with deciding what you're going to cover and what you're going to not cover. Also, at the same time, choosing not to cover something is potentially a way that, misinformation can spread without ever getting checked. So you have to there's this balance of, do I really want to give a platform, an additional platform to this information that I know is not true, but I also have a duty to fact check something. So it's walking that fine line, I think, of fact checking while also not perpetuating something that's false. And in terms of, I think, just like some really practical advice, like let's say you see a graphic on the internet and it's not true, instead of retweeting not true, put like an X over the picture, like alter the photo in some way so it's not going to be taken out of context and then repurposed again. That's something I think, especially for images, I think more and more we have to be cautious about what we're seeing on these like infographics that look really official but might not be. I don't know, those are kind of some of the things off the top of my head.
Yeah, it's like the social media version of like the Barbara Streisand effect, right? So you're just accidentally like amplifying more false information if you don't actually take those steps. So that's really good advice. Erin, what about it from your end?
So everything I report has to be fact checked in some way. So if it's an interview with a person recounting experiences to me, are there ways that they can help me verify that experience? Can they send me photos, for instance? Like at the start of the pandemic, I was doing a lot of reporting on the cruise ships and how coronavirus was moving through cruise ships. So with the passengers that I talked to, can you send me photos from your vacation of you on the trip? Can you send me your itinerary? Can you send me the activities packets that they sent you? Any sort of documentation, to help vet, were you actually there? And it's partially, the key thing is that it's about vetting, making sure that somebody is telling you something truthful, but all of those details also help you build a picture. They give you details that you might otherwise observe face to face. If it's data, walk me through how you collected the data. Where does it come from? Can I see the raw information? Can I talk to the researcher or whoever it was who gathered that data? So it's everything. It's the paper trail, it's the photos, the videos, being able to Zoom call with someone. I mean, when I'm vetting someone, from Twitter, for instance, if they don't want to talk to me on the phone, that's sort of a red flag of like, hey, why not? And, please, give me some reason. So, you're always looking for ways to corroborate or disprove whatever you learned. So yeah, and it's constantly being skeptical, which I think is very important in disasters, because unfortunately they do bring out people who are fabulous, who just want to be part of some big news event. And so you have to be really on your game when you're in these situations to make sure that the people that you're talking to, the information that you're putting out there is as accurate as possible.
Yeah, I think starting from a place of skepticism is, I've certainly become a much more skeptical person of everything that comes my way in the last several years. So yeah, that's a really good point.
I find that explaining it to people too, sometimes people are hesitant, like when you're like, hey, you just told me you had COVID. Can I see your medical records? And they're like, what are you going to do with those? And you're just like, hey, listen, I just need to, I'm not going to put them on the internet. I really just need to verify that you were actually in the hospital like you said you were.
Yeah, absolutely.
And most people are okay with that once they know what, so just try and be as open as possible too.
Yeah. Staying with you, Erin, as we start to look ahead, we're in the middle of some crises now, but how do you anticipate the upcoming hurricane season to impact our current situation? What are the things we should be thinking about, anticipating? How can we get ahead of this?
I mean, I think we have to be thinking now, right? And I know a lot of people are. I've talked to a lot of disaster officials, if you will, emergency managers. I think preparation and mitigation has to play a much bigger role now in conversations and actions ahead of these big disaster seasons, whether it's, this not even upcoming, this hurricane season that we're in the middle of, the wildfire season that's headed our way. Then you think about next spring and the flood season there. If we're still in the middle of this pandemic, you've got to be able to handle that. Be thinking about how you are going to mobilize your big response networks that normally you can feed in a massive cafeteria setting, or where you're going to put evacuees in a shelter. Like with social distance, all of that is changing, and so we have to be thinking now about how that's going to change the response plan, the need for people, the need for gear, what kind of equipment. Wildfires are fought very much on the ground, but now air attack is going to become more important in a lot of places. And so you have to be thinking, do we have the resources to handle that? And so these are all questions that I'm thinking about as a reporter, and going and asking the agencies that I report on in these situations. And so having someone who is thinking about these issues and being able to connect with them in advance of something happening is super important.
Yeah, I know that was sort of, related, but not exactly the same. But there was a lot of concern, immediately in the immediate days of the George Floyd protests, that would lead to, a surge in COVID positive cases. So managing that is certainly not an added thing that anyone is looking forward to, but I'm glad that people are thinking about that.
Right. Well, and knowing, we all went into that situation knowing. I went out to Minneapolis saying, okay, I know social distance probably going to be non-existent out here. What's that going to mean? So having it in the back of your mind, both as a I need to prepare for this and take the right kind of gear, but also, in 2-3 weeks time, I also need to be watching the numbers to see what's happening. Is there a surge? Isn't there a surge? That's going to be a story. So, thinking ahead and anticipating.
Yeah. Jacquie, going back just to strictly COVID for a moment, there's been so much speculation about the potential for there to be an upcoming vaccine, getting that quickly through the regulatory process and what is, a much faster approval process than what we would normally see. What are some of the concerns from folks in the regulatory space that you're hearing about this? Are there causes that you're hearing for optimism? Just what's that sort of overall situation look like?
So overall, health officials like Stephen Hahn, who's the head of the FDA, and Anthony Fauci, they've said that they're quote unquote cautiously optimistic, about a vaccine being ready sometime soon being, in early 2021. I think that's probably the soonest we would see one, on a realistic timeline. But just getting a vaccine approved or a vaccine that works isn't the only issue. let's say that we do get a vaccine, which there are some people that are still, hesitant that we even will get one. But let's say that we do get a vaccine. There's still going to be a lot of issues surrounding how do we get that vaccine out to as many people as possible? Are we going to have enough manufacturing capability to make all the doses we need? Are we going to have access to all of the vials, all of the stoppers, all of the syringes that we're going to need to give that vaccine? Are people going to take the vaccine? I think, especially in the last couple of weeks, there's been a more heavy focus on vaccine hesitancy as it relates to a COVID-19 vaccine, and the concern that that's creating among public health officials, that even if there is a vaccine, that people might not take it. You had mentioned some Pew research earlier, and Pew had also put out some research about people that would definitely take the vaccine. And I'm just going to pull it up right now. So a little over half of Black adults, 54%, said they would definitely or probably get a coronavirus vaccine if one were available. 44% said they would not. Whereas Hispanic and white adults, 74% said they would, while a quarter of them said that they would not. So, there's definitely going to be some vaccine hesitancy among certain groups, but there's definitely going to be different reasons for that vaccine hesitancy. And federal health officials have been talking about, well, how do we make sure that the people most impacted by coronavirus get a vaccine? So there's been talk about having, first frontline health workers having it first, and minority communities. And while that might sound all well and good, we have to keep in mind that, there's definite, in certain circumstances, a little bit of mistrust between minority communities, particularly in the Black community, and the medical establishment, given past injustices that they've faced by the medical community. And so there's going to have to be a reckoning of this past injustice that's taken place, and if we want to encourage that population to get a vaccine. And we also have to consider, while the FDA is really pushing for diversity in our clinical trials, is there going to be enough diversity in our clinical trials to really tell someone, hey, this is definitely going to work for you? Definitely that's a very hard thing to do with a vaccine, but we're just going to have to really consider the backgrounds that all these people have and why they might not get a vaccine, even if it were available.
That's a really interesting point. I'm glad that you brought that up. I think there's a lot of work that is going to have to be done to educate people about the vaccine, about how it works, and get them to a place of comfort before, we're really going to be able to see that take place. So there's sort of like the socialization part of the vaccine, but then there's also the more, just like, how do we get this done? How do we manufacture it? How do we distribute it? So that's sort of like process and distribution question as well. So we have all of that to look forward to. But so I don't know if you guys have anything else that you want to share with our audience today. Those were all of the questions that I had. I'm sure we have some questions that have come in from our viewers, but if you guys have any final words that you'd like to share.
No, I think I would just encourage everyone to be journalism advocates. Help us tell the story. Help us identify the story. Tell us when you think we're hitting the mark and when we're missing it. If you have interesting things going on that you think we should be reporting on and aren't, I'd like, drop us a line and let us know. And that's how journalism gets done.
Definitely. Some of my favorite stories that I've worked on have been someone DMing me on Twitter being like, hey, this is happening. And I'm like, that's pretty crazy. Like, let's talk. And then that kind of forms a story. So journalists are meant to be, easy to connect with and easy to get a hold of for a reason. We want you to talk to us, and we want you to be sending us things that you think we should be writing about. Because at the end of the day, like, we're working for you. So,
yeah.
Great. Well, I'm actually not seeing any questions come in from our audience. So if there are no final words, I would just like to thank you guys so much for taking your time out of what are no doubt very, very busy schedules to speak with us. And yeah, I hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for letting us chat with you.